Now we are going to discuss the features of behaviorism. The first important feature is the Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlovian conditioning discovered accidentally by the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov during certain experiment in years 1890s. Now this was what happened, that when he was working on the salivation process of dogs, he noticed that a dog would salivate whenever he would enter a room to feed them. And sometimes he noticed that the dog would salivate even if he is not bringing food for them. So this led him to conduct more experiments to see that how unconditioned stimulus, which is food, leads to unconditioned response, which is salivation. If we look at this image, we would see that during the experimentation process, you could see the observation screen, then you see the tube for collection of saliva, container of meat powder, you see the device to count drop of saliva, revolving drum for recording responses. Pavlov showed the existence of the unconditioned response by presenting a dog with a bowl of food and the measuring of its salivary secretions. Pavlov showed the existence of the unconditioned response by presenting a dog with a bowl of food and measuring its salivary secretions, as you can see in the image. Pavlov knew that somehow the dog in his lab had learned to associate food with his lab assistant, because whenever the lab assistant would enter, he or she would bring the food for the dogs and they would salivate. But this was something which they did not do earlier and which the dogs started to do later on at some point. That is how a change in the behaviors was observed. In behaviorist term, the lab assistant was neutral stimulus and it got association with this neutral stimulus got the association with the food and becomes unconditional stimulus. Pavlov used bell also, that whenever the food is given, he would ring the bell. So the dog started associating the bell, which was the neutral stimulus, to food, and that's how the process become from unconditioned stimulus to the conditioned stimulus, leading to the stimulus response. Now in the experiment, lab assistant was a neutral stimulus associated with unconditioned stimulus, which is food. Neutral stimulus means generating no response, but got associated with the unconditioned stimulus, which was food. Now in his experiment, Pavlov would ring the bell whenever the food is given to the dogs. The bell was first the neutral stimulus, but when this process was repeated, it got associated with the unconditioned stimulus, which was food. And that led to the conditioned response, which means salivation. So the neutral stimulus becomes conditioned stimulus, leading to the conditioned response. This is what Pavlov considered law of temporal contiguity, which means presenting of two stimuli to be close together in time of association making. Ringing of bell and serving the food without having any gap, presenting them closely together, cause or form an association. Let's try to discuss some of the key features of Pavlovian conditioning and then reflect the experiment that took place in Pavlov's labs. The first is stimulus. By stimulus, what we mean is that any feature that is there in the environment and that affects one's behavior. That is, in Pavlov's experiment, the stimulus was food. Second feature is response. That's what we mean by behavior, a kind of behavior which is elicited by the stimulus. In Pavlov's experiment, salivation was a response. unconditioned stimulus. That's a feature of any environment that causes a natural reflex action. That is, a puff air blown into eye causes an involuntary blink. So that is reflex action. That reflex action is unconditioned stimulus. Conditioned stimulus. It is a feature of the environment that has an effect through its association with unconditioned stimulus. That is, Pavlov's dog learned to salivate at the sound of the bell. So that is a stimulus. They would listen to the sound of the bell and then they would start to salivate. Conditioned response is the behavior which is elicited by conditioned stimulus. That is, salivation when the bell rings. Extinction is another feature, which means the dying out of a conditioned response by breaking the association between the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. Now, in the experiment, that was when the bell was repeatedly rang and a food presented, Pavlov's dog gradually stopped salivating at the sound of the bell. So that means the dying out of a conditioned response, because it kept on repeating for many times, and later on, after listening to bell, they would stop salivating. Spontaneous recovery is the term of a conditioned response. It is considered in a weaker form after a period of time, which means that, for example, in Pavlov's experiment, when Pavlov waited for a few days and then rang the bell once more, the dog salivated again. Second last feature says generalization. When a stimulus similar to the conditioned stimulus also elicits a response, that is, initially Pavlov's dog salivated at the sound of any bell, not just the food bell. That's generalization. And discrimination refers to, it's the opposite of generalization, that is, the ability of the subject to tell the difference between two similar stimuli, and eventually Pavlov's dog learns the difference between the sound of the two bells and no longer salivate at the sound of non-food bell. To conclude, Pavlovian conditioning is associating an unconditioned stimulus already responded to, that is a reflex, natural reflex action, with the new conditioned stimulus, so that the new stimulus brings about the same response.